All right. Well, hopefully all my technology will work as planned. This looks like it is so far, so. All right. So as I mentioned, I wanted to talk about, have us look at 2 Corinthians 4:13, 14, where Paul makes reference to this psalm, and look at the psalm to get this idea of what he means by a spirit of faith, right? What he means by a spirit of faith. So, starting with, again, the statement in 2 Corinthians 4:13 and 14, Paul says, "But having the same spirit of faith, according to what is written," and here's the quote, "I believed, therefore I spoke. We also believe, therefore we also speak." So it raises a lot of questions, is what was believed and what was spoken, right? I mean, he's referencing something, but what scripture is this? What was being believed at that moment? What was being spoken? So that's where we really need to spend some time and go back and look. And so the place we go is Psalm 116. And what I want to do is actually just read the whole psalm, because one of the things about quotes in New Testament writings is, of course, they can't say, well, this number, this verse, because they didn't have such a thing. So what they often did was just refer to a phrase, which then people knowing would recall the whole section, not just the phrase itself. So you can't just assume, well, he just quotes verse 10, so verse 10 is where all the answers are. No, when he quotes Psalm 116, verse 10, it is a way of referring to Psalm 116, just like when Jesus from the cross quotes Psalm 22 and says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" If you think that's the only thing you're supposed to look at and you don't actually read the psalm, then you'll draw the completely erroneous conclusions about what Jesus is saying. He's thinking about a psalm which promises that he won't be forsaken. And too often, well, I grew up with the teaching that he was forsaken, that the Father abandons the Son at the moment of his obedience, which then raises questions about why I should obey God, right? Because it sounds like if you obey God, he'll up and abandon you when you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, right? But see, when you read Psalm 22 and you realize he's invoking the opening words, so you think of the psalm because he's thinking of the psalm, then you realize the psalm is not saying he's abandoned, it's saying quite the opposite, in fact. So we're doing the same thing here in Psalm 116. So I want us to read together the whole thing and then just kind of get a feel for it. See how it's speaking. So, Psalm 116, I'll just read through it, and then we can back up and start exploring it. "I love the Lord because he hears my voice and my supplications. Because he has inclined his ear to me, therefore I shall call upon him as long as I live. The cords of death encompassed me, and the terrors of Sheol came upon me. I found distress and sorrow. Then I called upon the name of the Lord. O Lord, I beseech you, save my life. Gracious is the Lord and righteous. Yes, our God is compassionate. The Lord preserves the simple. I was brought low, and he saved me. Return to your rest, O my soul, for the Lord has dealt bountifully with you. For you have rescued my soul from death, my eyes from tears, my feet from stumbling. I shall walk before the Lord in the land of the living. I believed when I said, I am greatly afflicted. I said in my alarm, all men are liars. What shall I render to the Lord for all his benefits toward me? I shall lift up the cup of salvation and call upon the name of the Lord. I shall pay my vows to the Lord. Oh, may it be in the presence of all his people. Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his godly ones. O Lord, surely I am your servant. I am your servant, the son of your handmaid. You have loosed my bonds. To you I shall offer a sacrifice of thanksgiving and call upon the name of the Lord. I shall pay my vows to the Lord. Oh, may it be in the presence of all his people, in the courts of the Lord's house, in the midst of you, O Jerusalem, praise the Lord. Okay, what do we notice about this poetic expression? What are some of the things you notice coming out in this psalm?
He cried out to the Lord, and the Lord was faithful.
Okay, so there's this theme of I was in distress, I was in need, I cried out to the Lord, and the Lord was faithful. That's one of the things that's being stated for sure. Yep. What else? What was the nature of the distress? Well, yeah, I mean, because it's poetic, you're wondering, I mean, there's a statement, all men are liars. I think people are part of the problem, right? Right? I mean, that's a bit of a bitter statement. So something happened, right? Something went wrong. So, yeah, you've got the statement, all men are liars. So something's happened there. What else?
Kind of get the sense that all creation is groaning, maybe. It seems like there's some death. Sheol was mentioned.
Yeah, so the mention of death. Now here we are, we're in a poetic landscape, so now you got to wonder, was something happening that threatened his physical existence? I mean, is he literally talking about death, or is it a figure? But I like your take on it, John David. Invoking that groaning of creation, that creation itself is under the reign of death, of mortality, of brokenness. There's certainly a lot of that coming out, right? So the references early on to the cords of death bound about me, verse 3, the terrors of Sheol, that's the Jewish idea of the pit, the abyss, the realm of the dead, equivalent to like the Greeks, Hades, just where all the dead go. So now is he using poetic language and he really wasn't like deathly ill or something? But whatever, he likens his distress as like, I just thought my life was over. And maybe it's because of all men are liars. I don't know. But he's saying it just seemed like it was the end for me. So we can surmise that, right? So it's not a small passing matter that he faced. It was a serious situation that made him despair perhaps of life.
He changed his attitude from verse 1
Mm-hmm.
to the end because he was despairing. And then he ends up in verse 15, which we have heard plenty of people quote this: precious is in the sight of the Lord is the death of his faithful servants.
Yeah.
So it's like he came to accept the fact that if I die, it's going to be okay. And he wasn't that way at the first verse. He's chronicling a little journey
Yeah.
from despair to acceptance, is the way I see it. And I really agree with that about precious in the sight of the Lord, death of his faithful servants. I've often said some people that have died in my family, it's good that they went on because they didn't need to see some stuff that's happened. They got saved from some of the stuff that's been going on and is going on.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
that's kind of a catchphrase. Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his faithful servants. But, sometimes we can see it
Yeah.
already.
And isn't that, I'm recalling that as a statement used by John in Revelation. From now on, something like, precious are those who die in the Lord. If it's not quoted, it's alluded to in Revelation, which again, John, there you got, John and Paul are so similar. I mean, it's,
Wow.
in my experiences, like there's Johannine theology and there's Pauline theology, is like they're very different. And some work, I keep talking about this Father John Bear because he's just brilliant. He keeps showing that there is such unity. Now, maybe they choose some different theological language, but they are on the same page, right? So this would be another case where Paul and John, I mean, if John's alluding to Psalm 116, so is Paul. They think alike. Now, they might express themselves in different vocabulary, and you say, well, John's the apostle of love, and Paul's talking about justification, and John doesn't talk about, but really, there's not a difference there. It's just ways of choosing to express things. So it's picking up on that same theme. In the face of martyrdom, there's the same statement John picks up. Precious, from this point on, precious are those who die in the Lord, right? Which is the same sort of conviction, right?
Well, and a friend of ours died this week, or last week, and we went to his funeral this week. This guy was my very age. And he has been suffering, he has had cancer for 27 years. Like 6 different kinds of cancer. And it's just suffered so much. You have to believe, thank God, Larry is out of a horrible situation and out of pain.
Yep. Well, what about the, just while we're noticing things, the statement, verse 9. Does anyone else recall where a similar statement is made in the Old Testament? I shall walk before the Lord in the land of the living. I think it's in Job. There's Job, where in the midst of all his despairing, he kind, I will see my Redeemer. Yeah, I will see him, not another, but me. I will see him in this life. So there's this conviction of I can see God in the here and now. Again, to me, and so similar. I mean, this psalm is a psalm talking about hardship, suffering, despair, the possibility of giving it all in, just giving up on it all of it. Job is the same sort of piece of literature. Revelation is the same sort of piece of literature. What do we do as Christians now that we're undergoing such persecution? You see a theme popping up that I can have confidence that I will see God somehow active in the land of the living. Now that's an interesting kind of theological theme between some very similar pieces of literature.
What does the land of the living refer to, do you think?
Now there you go, because we're talking poetry.
Like Psalm 27 says, I would have fainted lest I had believed to see the Lord in the land of the living. Is that later, or is that presence of the Lord?
Or at least two or three options. Yeah, I mean, in one sense, I take it to have something to do with the here and now, because pretty much, and so much Jewish thought really didn't extend much beyond the grave. I mean, you went down to Sheol, that's it. It's not that there's non-existence, but there's no resurrection back to the land of the living. You just continue to be in this realm of the dead. So one way that I take it is this sense of, even now in my mortal body, in this life, I will still witness the goodness of the Lord. But now, when we're reading it metaphorically as Christians, which we should do, now the land of the living takes on a whole new realm of possibilities for us. And it might have even for them, just because when push comes to shove, you see some of that, you see it in Ecclesiastes as well, this sense in which I have to grasp at something beyond the parameters of what we've been thinking. I think Ecclesiastes does that as well. At certain points, it says, I can talk about what's under the sun, but I think there's got to be something more. So it could be possible that even in the context, they were envisioning a land of the living that somehow defied Sheol. Not that they had a fully developed sense of the resurrection, but maybe just a sense that there has to be more. It just all doesn't end in the grave. So I think there's a number of possibilities. I don't know, but what we do know is there's some sort of confidence. There's some sort of confidence. It'll be life, not death. Somehow living, not die. Right? Yeah, Alan?
Well, if I'm a literalist here, he talks about the Job life experience in the middle of the psalm. At the start, he's saying, I love the Lord because he listened to me. He answered, my prayers. And at the end, he's, calling, I'm gonna live in the Lord's house and be with you and praise the Lord. So I do wonder if it's where he was greatly afflicted with, maybe he was mortally wounded and recovered. And I think about what you said in your meditation. I was gonna say sermon, I know you don't like that word, so meditation. He dried my eyes from tears. And your comment about Jesus, that people don't like, he cried, and he was gonna resurrect and everything. Where I can relate sort of to the Psalms is I've grown in my faith and in my willingness not to be a cynic and be more loving, looking at other people. I'm a weak monster.
Which is probably a good thing.
It doesn't take much to get me kind of weak about it. Candy saw for the first time one of these Jesus Knows Us commercials that came on last night. It was really a very good one. And at the end, they were just saying, what are things you can say, like, I'm sorry. What's hard to say? I'm sorry. I love you. Things like that. And I kind of started bubbling up again. I was like, holy cow. But why wouldn't Jesus cry at the grave with
Right.
what God is about to do in happiness, about the sadness of that? And
Yeah, but if
he had perfect faith,
Yeah.
so therefore he had perfect weeping.
Yeah. The moment, right? If the moment's sad, then like Paul, we rejoice with those who rejoice, and we mourn, we weep with those who weep. There's nothing about, we tell those who weep, it's all going to be okay. No, Paul says we weep with those who weep, right? So the only place to live with God is in the present moment. And if this moment is a sad moment, then God is in the sadness with us. And he's not a God that I experienced in the past, though I can see how I experienced him in the past, and I cannot experience him in the future, though I will experience him in the future. The only place that God is present is right now, in this moment, happy, sad, whatever the moment is. And I take great comfort in the idea of a weeping God, of a God who suffers with us. No other God makes any sense. Not that God has to make sense, but you're going to have real trouble getting me to worship a God who's dismissive of my agonies, even if my agonies are not the agonies I think they are. So like my granddaughter, if she's upset, I see a bigger frame of reference, but she's upset about something small, but I feel for her being upset about something small. Because for her, it's not small, right? It's what that moment was. And that's where God is with us, I think, right? So, and you've got the point, the Psalm, he begins by saying kind of where he ended up. Then he tells you in the middle the story of what happened. And then at the end, he gives his resolve now to live in light of this. So the beginning is, but what he didn't realize until the story played out, the beginning is God was faithful. Now let me tell you what happened. I was this, I was that, I was despairing, and I cried out, and God, and then all the end part is, so what have I resolved to do? Pay my vows, testify to the Lord. So here's how I now live differently in light of this story I've told you. And a lot of Psalms follow that pattern. They may start with the end, right? Telling you not that the person had that and then that's where they ended up after the journey that went through all these other verses. But they may start with, the Lord is good and he answers your prayers. Now, let me tell you how I've learned that. And it wasn't easy.
This is almost like my new favorite song. And I mean, how can we not relate to that?
I agree.
Love me, and then I've got all these tragedies and problems, and of course, they really aren't that. But the other thing I wanted to just add to what you said, and then I'll shut up, was that you said dismissive, that God's not dismissive of our weeping and everything. You know, I've become a weeping giant, as Candy says. And that probably relates to me being so dismissive of any male who wept in my 20s and 30s,
Yeah.
40s,
Right.
thinking what weak men they are, that they cannot muster up the courage to not
Right.
weep.
The stoicism, right? The stoicism to
You know,
squash their emotions. Yeah.
She's heard it a gazillion times. I'm like, I can't believe that guy.
Yeah. Yeah. But thank God that there's this journey of grace where we learn that that's not true masculinity, is to stuff your emotions and to be stoic. Tenderness is as much what men should be about. Sometimes we stereotypically say, well, women are nurturing and tender, and men are tough. And okay, right. But those aren't necessarily ideals to which we should live up, as if God revealed it that way and said, this is who you were supposed to be. I agree. Yeah. I was always even as a young person, I get choked up. And so as a kid, I was like, I don't like those mushy movies. Well, the reality was because I got a lump in my throat and I was afraid of crying I'm not going to watch those mushy movies. Give me something, because I was scared to death of, I get this lump in my throat and I'm afraid I'm going to burst out in tears, and that's not going to be acceptable. So I'm in that whole denial of my emotions sort of thing to try and be the man I think I'm supposed to be at 13 or whatever, ridiculous stuff that I'm trying to do. Yeah, that our culture is not, helping us. We have to push back. Okay, John David.
Something that a couple of folks I feel like have talked about that really helped me was Walter Brueggemann's approach to the Psalms in general. So what he pointed out is a lot of scholars have a tendency to say this psalm is a mourning psalm, and this psalm is one of praise, and this psalm is whatever. And he does engage in that initial classification to say the way I'm going to approach them is orientation, disorientation, reorientation. But then at the end of that book, what he confesses is the reality is there are lines within Psalms that are orienting, disorienting, and reorienting. And
Yeah.
I think Psalm 116 is a good example of that.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, so if you're familiar with Derrida's, when we talk some about deconstruction and reconstruction, and that the disorientation, reorientation, order, disorder, reorder is the way Richard Rohr puts it. Yeah, it's a pattern that we when we look around, we realize this is true. This is just pattern in everything tends to work this way. We start seeing it. So yeah, that's a good thing to remember. Yeah, is this a psalm of praise or is this a psalm of lament? Well, which part of the psalm? Part of it's full of praise, part of it's full of confidence, part of it's expressing doubt and lament. Okay, but let's focus in. Now we've kind of seen the overall. Why does Paul pick on this one to talk about what he's talking about, right? So he's using verse 10. And verse 10 is surprising because he only quotes the first line of the couplet, and the second line is somewhat surprising. Paul quotes the first line, I believed, therefore I spoke, is how he quotes it. But what was spoken? I'm greatly afflicted. Wait. That's a statement of belief? According to the psalm, it is. According to what Paul's saying, that's belief. I am greatly afflicted. How is that a statement of faith?
Well, Jesus said, in the world, you will have trouble. Thank you. It's not all gonna be great,
Yeah,
but I have overcome the world.
yeah.
And this is our life. I mean, you wake up, you go, well, shucks, I don't feel well, and I gotta go babysit, and I got these 85 other things to do, and oh my gosh, how am I gonna get it done? And then something comes in and goes, well, it's all good. Remember, I've overcome the world. That's our life.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if you make it to the end of the day and you're still alive, you have overcome the world.
That's a win. Put that in the win column. You got through it. Yeah. See, and this is what Paul's calling on, right? He's saying, just like the scripture says, I believe, therefore I spoke. So we believe and we speak. But what does he go on to talk about? Struggles in the world, the decaying of our outward self, but the renewing of our inward self. Do you see how what he says in 2 Corinthians is this thing? It is the expression of, I am greatly afflicted. Right? That's what Paul's saying. Are we greatly afflicted? Paul's being honest. Yes, we are. Our outer man is decaying, but our inner man is being renewed. The things that are visible, they're temporal and they seem awful, but the things that are unseen are eternal. And they're here as well. So it seems to me Paul is really, as he's talking to these Corinthian Christians, talking about the struggles of life, the difficulties, and then yet the hope in things unseen and things eternal. He's basically channeling Psalm 116. In other words, he's saying, I'm in a good tradition here. When we speak faithfully, we say, I am afflicted. Because we're honest about the reality of life as it is. We're not pretending like, oh, I'm blessed. Well, didn't your mother pass away? Yeah, but I'm blessed. You know, I'm kind of like, are you in denial? Or are you grieving this fact? Or are you just somehow insisting that God is good and everything's fine? Or are you fully embracing like, no, this really is awful and I'm miserable right now? But that is the place where faith lives itself out, right? I think that's why Paul grabs this psalm, refers to it, and says, we're speaking with the same spirit of faith. One that says, I believe, and therefore I speak, and what do you speak? The harsh realities of earthly life. But we speak them in a context of knowing, like Edwin is saying, life is difficult. The first principle of Buddhism, as I understand from Scott Peck, who wrote it, who was a Buddhist before he became a Christian. When he wrote The Road Less Traveled, very famous book of decades ago, he was a Buddhist, and he said the first principle of Buddhism is life is difficult. I mean, that's a starting place. Let's start with the obvious. Life is difficult. And Buddhism, from that point, tries to work out, so how do you live in terms of the difficulties? I think Christianity is the same approach. Yeah, life is difficulty. Genesis, the world is fallen. Things are not pristine and wonderful. Now, how do we live? Right? To me, that's what Paul's saying. Does that make sense? You see how, for him, the spirit of faith is that's why I said it, I think it's that sense of the narrow way of choosing what is not an easy path, which is to live in defiance of the immediate and obvious for the less obvious, but actually more immediate to us, of the eternal. When you choose to live that way, that's a narrow path. I think one seldom taken, but it's worth the journey.
There was a time when I would not name the elephant in the room,
Yeah.
and now with this verse, I can see that I was living out of fear. I was not trusting him.
Yeah. That's a great point. Yeah. When we can name the elephant, when we can name the monster, when we can name with what's wrong, that's a statement of faith. It doesn't have to equate with I'm giving into despair. It means I can name this and face it for what it is and still go on. That's what the Psalm, I think, is saying. That's what Paul's saying. We still press on even though the outer man is decaying, the inner man's being renewed, right? There's life within while there's death without. And we all know that life comes from death, right? It's just pattern. Okay, Kabi, you were going to share something?
I'll refer back to that Psalm 27 I mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
I had fainted, or I would be in despair had I not seen the goodness of the Lord. Then he goes on to say, wait on the Lord, be of good courage. He shall strengthen your heart. So that's that. It takes courage to have faith.
Yes. And this book that I've read, that I've referenced a few times, it's been really good, but I've told you all don't read it. I mean, just because it is ridiculously difficult. But the title of the book is The Courage to Be. And Paul Tillich, that's his definition of faith. He's the theologian who wrote it. And he says basically, faith is the courage to be. And to be is over against non-being. Like some philosophers, like I think Camus said, no, the only real decision we have is whether to commit suicide or not. That's the only real decision. And in some ways he's right, because if you make the decision not to, then you're pressing forward against whatever you're facing. The courage to be, that's faith. And so Psalm 27 is called, it's the courage. So that's what I meant by saying it's choosing this hard way. It's not the easy way of, I'm going to speak that I'm afflicted, and yet I'm going to face it. I'm still going to press on, right? That the courage to be over against not being, right? Like just, ultimate despair, giving up. So every day that we get up and we say, well, here, we press on, that's faith, right? That's pressing on.
And don't judge other people. Look at poor old Kenny. We've been praying for Kenny all this time. Kenny's been drinking because he was taking care of his mother. He's miserable.
Yeah.
I mean, I heard a psychiatrist that I used to work with, oncology psychiatrist, said people who are drinking heavily or taking drugs after college age, they're just trying to get up to normal. They're trying to get up to where most people are already. And Kenny's been drinking all this time because he's been in a miserable situation. His mother was real sick and now she's died. Yes, of course Kenny's been drunk since she died. His purpose of life is taken away. He does not know where he is going now.
Yeah.
We cannot judge him.
Right.
We just have to pray for him.
Right. Yeah. When we see things like that in terms of moral failure, like a lack of willpower, we totally misunderstand the dynamics. And then if someone were to throw that back on us in our struggle, well, you just lack the willpower, then we'd be like, no. No, I think you're exactly right. It's so easy. It's easy for society in general to judge certain failings as a lack of willpower or a lack of morality, when we ought to realize, if faith is the courage to be, some people who are struggling against overwhelming odds, far surpassing what we face, are people of greater faith than us. Because my struggles are not comparable to Kenny's. And if he's been struggling since he was a teenager, he's got greater faith, the courage to be, than I do. Right? He's had a hard, and that's just so often not how we look at things. We look down on people and think, what's wrong? Why can't they get it together? When actually, they're getting up every morning and getting it together, where compared to what they have to face, when I get up in the morning, my day's easy. But they're pressing on against odds much greater than mine, right? So, compassionate view, and this view that, I like the idea, and this was a C.S. Lewis thing, but it's a good point. His point is, so you watch a play, this is his illustration, you watch a play, and one actor plays the king and one actor plays the beggar. And after the play's over, they all come out and you give them all a round of applause. Was the actor who played the king a better actor because he played the king? Or maybe the actor who played the beggar was the brilliant actor. And he's kind of like, it's that way in life. You know, we tend to judge, well, the kings are better and the beggars are not as good. Where if it were a play, we would maybe give the greatest applause to the best performance, which was given by the beggar. His analogy is we don't really know who's living the better life. We really don't. We can judge it externally, but we don't know how God sees it. You know, God may say, well done, good and faithful servant. And we're saying, you said that to her? You know, the woman caught in adultery, you're saying, well done? Maybe well done. You know, that's the point he's making is who are we to assess what people, how their faith was expressed in what they were up against, right? So anyway, that I think feeds into this discussion. Do you have something else, John David?
I like thinking about what could have been grieving Paul.
Mm.
And then I also, I've heard several people ask what would grieve Paul today. And the first thing that comes to my mind when what was grieving Paul was that the joy of the Lord was not shared by so many of his Jewish brethren who he was working so diligently to get them to see the beauty of the Messianic age coming to life. And then I think if Paul were alive today, I share what a lot of other people say about the division that we have, that it would just be so foreign to him, that all these years later we're so divided.
Yeah, for someone who worked diligently to somehow bring Jews and Greeks into table fellowship in little communities, which would hearken the coming age. Wow. Yeah, the church hasn't really done a great job of trying to create such communities. And the thing you say also makes me think of G.K. Chesterton, when so he's this great, you know, writer and stuff of whatever the 1800s, and so the London paper, somebody was asking a bunch of notable people, what's wrong with the world today? And G.K. Chesterton's response was, me. He declined the opportunity to poke, you know, wag his finger at all the other problems. He just said, it's me. I'm the problem. Which he's right. See, that's where there's a guy thinking like Jesus, right? The only problems I can address are the ones in me. And the only problems I can really see are my problems. So what's the problem with the world? Me. Because that's where I've got to do my work, right? Work on me. So, yeah, great thoughts. All right, 12 o'clock. If you can stay for the meal, I invite you to stay for the meal. And if not, have a blessed week as you go about your work.